This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The Arizona desert was endless and isolating, a stretch of rugged, sun-baked land that faded into blurred mountains on the horizon. Its red dust clung to the low shrubs, cacti, and sparse ranches dotting the dry, unforgiving terrain. The Johnson family's ranch sat several miles from the nearest town, a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. The Johnsons were a family that had lived in Arizona for generations. Leroy and Diane Johnson were known for their warmth and hospitality, and they prided themselves on opening their hearts and their home to those in need. Leroy, a retired firefighter, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a booming laugh and a firm sense of right and wrong. Diane, a social worker, was gentle but strong-willed, her empathy seemingly boundless. Together they had built a family that celebrated resilience, love, and community. Their 4 children ranged in age from 6 to 16, and 2 elderly grandparents also lived with them, rounding out a household filled with laughter and noise. When Leroy and Diane decided to adopt, it felt like a natural extension of their values. They'd gone through years of foster care, opening their home to children of all backgrounds, and always managing to make space for one more. After a long process with an adoption agency, they were introduced to Caleb, a 14-year-old white boy with pale skin, light brown hair, and piercing blue eyes. He was small and lean for his age, with a guarded, quiet demeanor that masked his inner turmoil. Caleb had grown up in a series of unstable homes, bouncing around from one foster family to another. He didn't speak much about his past, and the agency file was vague, mentioning only that he'd struggled with attachment issues and had been moved around several times due to behavioral challenges. The Johnsons were optimistic, convinced that they could break through Caleb's walls with patience and kindness. They believed love and support could heal even the deepest wounds. When Caleb first arrived, the family welcomed him eagerly. The children, initially shy, quickly warmed up to him, trying to include him in games, chores, and family dinners. The grandparents offered gentle encouragement, often sharing stories from their own youth to try to bond with him. Caleb, however, felt an intense discomfort from the start. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, and remained silent when spoken to, rarely responding to anyone's attempts at connection. As the weeks passed, Caleb's discomfort turned to resentment. It wasn't just the adjustment to a new family, it was this family. In private moments, he would stare at them with a barely concealed bitterness, a feeling he couldn't entirely explain even to himself. He felt like he didn't belong. The ranch was spacious, but Caleb still felt suffocated, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He could barely stand to look at his adopted family, and yet everywhere he turned, he was forced to see them, their dark skin, their laughter, their effortless camaraderie, things that seemed to highlight everything he lacked. The Johnsons began to notice Caleb's behavior, his tendency to isolate himself, and the way he barely acknowledged them. Leroy, always the first to break tension, attempted to bond with Caleb by teaching him about ranch work, but Caleb's responses were monosyllabic at best. Diane would encourage him to open up about his feelings, but her gentle probing only seemed to make him close off further. The younger children, eager to include Caleb, tried to invite him to play, but Caleb's cold stares and dismissive responses eventually discouraged them. It was Diane who first began to worry that Caleb's problems might run deeper than mere shyness. She noticed subtle signs. Caleb flinched when someone touched him unexpectedly. His gaze often seemed filled with anger or suspicion, and he spent long hours alone in his room or wandering the outskirts of the ranch. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it looked more like a sneer. She suggested therapy, but Caleb refused outright, claiming he didn't need to talk to anyone. One day, Caleb overheard Diane on the phone with a friend, confiding her worries. "I think Caleb's struggling more than we thought," she'd said, her tone thick with concern. "He's been through so much, but he doesn't trust us. I just wish I could reach him somehow. Maybe it's time to consider a therapist, at least for a few sessions." To Caleb, her words were a betrayal. He already felt like an outsider, and now he believed they saw him as a problem that needed fixing. His resentment intensified, fueled by the notion that his own adoptive family couldn't accept him as he was. They expected him to open up, to melt into their world, to become a part of their life. But he didn't want any part of it. He hadn't asked for their kindness, their acceptance, or their attempts at closeness. That night he lay awake in his small bedroom, staring at the ceiling. The walls felt like they were closing in, the quiet sounds of the house a creak of floorboards, the muffled laughter from the living room filling him with a deep, simmering rage. Why did they take him in if they couldn't understand him? Why did they expect him to act like one of them? Caleb spent more and more time online, seeking out forums and groups that would validate his feelings of anger and isolation. He stumbled upon extremist sites, places where hate was fed and nurtured, where his resentment found fertile ground. The things he read gave him a sense of belonging he had never felt before, validating the hostility that grew within him. These voices whispered to him that his anger was righteous, that his adoptive family's kindness was fake and condescending, and that he was right to reject them. The Johnsons, sensing that something was wrong but unable to pinpoint it, continued trying to reach out. Leroy suggested a camping trip, hoping it would bond them. The grandparents, noticing Caleb's fascination with the stars, bought him a telescope, hoping it would give him a sense of wonder and focus. Diane continued to cook his favorite meals, leaving them outside his door when he refused to join the family at the dinner table. But all their efforts only seemed to deepen his resentment. Each act of kindness felt like a reminder of how different they were, how he didn't belong. Days turned to weeks, and Caleb's mood grew darker. He began to imagine what it would be like to escape, to be rid of these people who seemed determined to keep him close, despite his obvious disdain. He fantasized about leaving them, about finding a way to assert his independence, to break free from the stifling kindness they insisted on giving him. But another thought began to grow within him, a darker and more sinister idea. The family had taken him in, showered him with undeserved kindness, tried to include him in their lives, and for that he despised them. One evening, after another tense dinner that he refused to attend, Caleb sat in his room, staring at the desert outside his window. The sky was darkening, the sun sinking below the horizon, casting long shadows over the ranch. In the growing silence, a plan began to form in his mind, a way to escape once and for all, to rid himself of this family and their suffocating embrace. Caleb's days fell into a monotonous rhythm. His room, isolated in the far wing of the house, was dark, cluttered, and increasingly untidy, his own domain where he could keep the world out. Yet, the quiet of the Arizona desert was deceptive. Every day seemed the same, yet each moment was another chance for resentment to grow, for anger to creep up on him in moments when he least expected it. It was during one of those quiet days that Caleb began to act on the frustration simmering within him. He decided that, rather than retreat, he would retaliate in subtle ways. He didn't just avoid the family, he began doing small things that unsettled them, testing their reactions. He found their routines predictable, their values naive, their trust easy to exploit. At dinner, he would mutter sharp, almost whispered comments under his breath, comments that would make Diane pause and glance at him. But he'd say them quietly enough that she couldn't be sure what she'd heard. When Leroy came to his room to chat, Caleb would stare at him, cold and unblinking, as if daring him to keep speaking. Late at night, he would go to the children's rooms and rearrange their things, putting the stuffed toys of his younger siblings in strange positions, swapping their school books, or placing eerie, unsettling notes on their bedside tables, scrawled in handwriting that they wouldn't recognize. At first, the kids were frightened, but as the notes continued to appear, their parents assured them it was just a misunderstanding, or maybe even a prank by a neighbor kid. However, Caleb would leave just enough clues to plant doubt, and when the parents would ask him directly, he'd smile, cryptically denying it, leaving a lingering sense of discomfort. The Johnsons began to suspect that something was wrong, but they couldn't reconcile it with their idea of who Caleb was. Diane, a woman of deep faith and optimism, began to insist on family meetings, hoping to clear the air. She wanted to give everyone a chance to express their feelings in a safe, open environment. It was in one of these sessions that Caleb finally spoke his mind, or at least a version of it. "I don't get why you pretend this is a family," he said, his voice cold and flat. "I didn't choose this. I was put here. But you all act like I should just fit in, like I should be happy. But I'm not. I didn't ask for this, and I don't want it." The family sat in stunned silence, his words hanging heavily in the air. Diane blinked, struggling to respond. "Caleb, I know it's been hard. It's an adjustment, and we know you're still figuring things out, but we love you, and we want you here with us." He snorted, rolling his eyes. "Love me? You don't even know me. And I don't know any of you. You think that just because you say we're a family, I should fall in line and be like you." Leroy, sitting beside Diane, placed a hand on her shoulder, a tense calm in his voice. "We just want to help you find your place here, Caleb. That's all." Caleb laughed, a dark, mocking sound. "I have a place. It's just not in this house with that. He pushed his chair back, the sound echoing through the room, and left. He heard Diane begin to cry softly as he walked away, and Leroy trying to comfort her, but he felt nothing. No guilt. No hesitation. The following day, Diane surprised Caleb by coming to his room and asking if he'd like to help her with some gardening. He nearly laughed out loud but hid it. Her persistence was remarkable, even pathetic. She looked at him with hope, as if trying to convince him that this small, peaceful activity could soften his heart, could make him part of their world. He agreed just to see what would happen, feeling a dark thrill at the idea of playing along, only to crush her hopes later. In the garden, Diane carefully explained the delicate ways of tending to plants, nurturing life from tiny seeds and caring for each fragile sprout. Caleb watched her, outwardly attentive, but inside he felt only contempt. Here she was, nurturing the soil, caring for each leaf, every flower, and it sickened him. When her back was turned, he dug his heel into one of the freshly planted rows, smashing the delicate sprouts beneath his foot. Later he noticed Diane's face cloud as she saw the damage, her smile faltering. "It's all right," she murmured. "Sometimes things get hurt and we just have to keep going." The garden incident was just one of many quiet acts of rebellion. Caleb's bitterness grew as he continued to seek out ways to undermine their trust in him. But it wasn't enough. The hate simmered beneath the surface, craving more. He found himself online again, reading through forums that spoke to his anger. One user, who went by the name Viper, encouraged him to stand up for himself and reclaim his freedom. Caleb spent long nights in conversation with Viper, sharing his resentment, even hinting at how much he despised the Johnsons. Viper's messages were carefully worded but unmistakably encouraging, a subtle nod toward the power he could claim if he truly embraced his anger. One evening, Caleb went further. He decided to try what Viper had suggested, making the family pay in a way they'd never forget that night. He slipped out to the old barn, knowing the children sometimes played there. He scrawled disturbing words on the walls, phrases like "you don't belong" and "they'll never love you." When the kids found it, they ran back, screaming and crying, convinced some intruder had targeted them. Diane and Leroy were deeply unsettled. They filed a report with the police, thinking it was a hate crime from outside their family. But Caleb's only reaction was to watch with dark amusement as Diane tearfully described the incident to her friends, blaming herself for bringing Caleb to a place where he was still so vulnerable. Then, something happened that Caleb hadn't planned for. He overheard Diane talking to Leroy about the possibility of placing Caleb in a specialized care facility. "Maybe he needs more help than we can give," she whispered one evening, her voice thick with grief. "Maybe he needs a place where he can heal, where professionals can reach him. I thought we could help, but maybe he needs more." This was the moment Caleb had been waiting for, but he didn't feel the triumph he had expected. Instead, he felt anger, fury even. It was as if they were casting him aside, discarding him like trash. "They're just as fake as I thought," he told himself. And yet, a hollow feeling gnawed at him, a small, unwelcome sense of rejection that he couldn't shake. In a last attempt to make them pay, he turned to sabotage. He tampered with the ranch's equipment, letting the water tank run dry and damaging the family's car brakes so that the next trip to town was a perilous one. Leroy managed to bring the vehicle to a stop just in time, but the fear in the family's eyes haunted them for days. Caleb acted as if he was equally shocked, claiming he had no idea what had happened, but inside he was elated. Now they'll understand fear, he thought. Now they'll know how it feels to be helpless. But the satisfaction was fleeting. Each small victory only left him wanting more, craving a deeper release of his anger, a more final way to lash out. When he returned to the forums, Viper's messages took on a darker tone, encouraging him to take control once and for all, and put an end to the people holding him back, the family dinners, the whispered conversations he overheard, and the attempts to reach him. They all became fuel for the fire, evidence in his mind of the lies he'd been fed. One evening, Caleb stood outside, staring at the stars with a blank expression. The family had given him a telescope weeks ago, hoping to share his fascination with the night sky, but now he barely looked at it. He didn't need distant stars, he didn't need hollow gestures or kindness. He needed release. The desert wind was still, the ranch quiet, and in that silence he finally began to imagine a way out, an ultimate plan that would sever him from the Johnsons forever. He didn't want escape, he wanted revenge. Caleb's rage had simmered long enough, it was now a boiling, ceaseless ache that gnawed at him day and night. He was no longer satisfied with minor acts of sabotage or whispered provocations. It felt like the family's every breath, every act of kindness, was a calculated insult, an attempt to manipulate him into submission. Every word from them sounded like a knife scraping against raw nerves. He wanted them gone, not just from his life but from existence itself. One particularly stifling evening, he lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, feeling the walls press in. The desert heat lingered in his room, even at night, and he could hear the faint murmur of the family talking and laughing downstairs, their voices mingling in warmth and familiarity. That closeness only fueled his isolation, a reminder of everything he had never been part of, everything he hated them for having. He clenched his fists, feeling an urge to scream. The air was thick, pressing in on him, and with each second that passed, his control frayed a little more. The breaking point came unexpectedly, triggered by a single conversation he happened to overhear. He was walking past the den, headed toward the kitchen for a late-night snack, when he heard his name. He paused, and through the dimly lit hallway, he saw Diane and Leroy sitting on the worn couch, their expressions grave. Diane's face was pale, her fingers nervously tracing patterns on the armrest as she leaned in close to her husband. "I don't know," Leroy Diane whispered, her voice tinged with desperation. "I'm scared. I don't want to say it, but it's like he doesn't care about us at all. The looks he gives the kids, they're unsettling. They used to love having him here, but now they avoid him. And yesterday, Eliza told me she's been having nightmares about Caleb." She paused, swallowing hard, her fingers trembling. "Maybe he's dangerous." Leroy sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, and looked at her with a resigned weariness. "I thought we could reach him, Diane. But I'm starting to think, maybe you're right, maybe it's time we look into a facility. A place with real professionals, people who know how to handle this." Those words hit Caleb like a slap. A facility. They were going to throw him away. Just like everyone else, they were planning to dump him somewhere, wash their hands of him, and move on. They saw him as damaged, dangerous. His heart pounded in his chest, his face flushed with a rage that made his vision blur. They'd promised him a family, promised him stability, and now they wanted to lock him up, to erase him from their lives. Diane's voice softened. "We have to think about the other kids, Leroy. This can't go on. What if he does something we can't undo?" Her words were cautious, as though the suggestion itself was forbidden. It was too much. The sting of betrayal felt like acid coursing through his veins, eating away at every last thread of control. They wanted him gone? Fine. But they would regret ever thinking of discarding him like he was nothing. He turned, his footsteps silent as he crept back to his room, each step hardening his resolve. He would make them pay. He had to make them understand that he was no one to be thrown away. In his room, Caleb paced, heart racing with a dark sense of purpose. His mind was racing, a whirlwind of thoughts so vivid they seemed to burn themselves into his skull. He knew this family well now, knew their routines, their vulnerabilities. He knew exactly where Leroy kept the keys to the gun cabinet, tucked away in the drawer of his desk, thinking it safe from the children. The Johnsons were all in bed early, save for the occasional late-night check on the kids. By midnight, the house would be silent. For hours he lay in bed, every muscle taut, his mind churning. The house settled into quiet. When the soft glow of the hall lights dimmed and the last bedroom door closed, he slipped out of bed and moved through the shadows, every step cautious, deliberate. He made his way to Leroy's study and found the drawer. His fingers trembled as he pulled it open, finding the cold, metallic keys nestled under a stack of papers. With a careful twist, he opened the cabinet, revealing the hunting rifle Leroy used to take his eldest son out shooting in the desert. Caleb pulled it out, feeling a strange thrill at the weight of it, the steel cold against his skin. He held the rifle in his hands, his eyes wide and intent, as he moved quietly to the living room window, where he could see the wide expanse of the Arizona desert under a sky filled with stars. The desert was empty, vast, a silent witness to whatever would happen here. Caleb felt an electric surge, a sense of control he had never felt before. This was the answer. This was how he'd ensure they could never send him away. They wouldn't live to try. But as he stood there, he heard a creak behind him. He spun around, heart hammering, to find Eliza, the youngest of the children, standing in the hallway. Her small figure was bathed in the dim glow of the hallway nightlight, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She stared at the rifle in his hands, her mouth opening to form words that wouldn't come out. "What? What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. A surge of panic hit him. She'd seen him. He knew he couldn't let her scream. Before he even processed the thought, He moved forward, raising his hand in a shushing gesture, and managed to calm her down with a quiet voice. "Eliza," he said, kneeling down so he was eye level with her, his voice as soothing as he could manage. "I'm just checking it, okay? Making sure it's safe. Go back to bed." Her eyes lingered on the rifle, her face uncertain. But after a long moment she nodded, her tiny feet shuffling back toward her room, her gaze cast nervously over her shoulder. He waited until she disappeared behind her door before exhaling, his fingers trembling around the rifle's grip. He hadn't planned for anyone to wake up. He hadn't planned for the look in her eyes. Shaken but determined, he forced himself to focus. He would follow through. He had to. He'd spent too long hiding, letting them assume he was weak, letting them think they could push him around. But they didn't know him, not really. They thought he was just some scared kid. Tonight they would understand what he was truly capable of. With a renewed sense of resolve, he moved back to the master bedroom door. He could hear Leroy's steady breathing through the thin wood. Just the thought of it filled him with a twisted sense of satisfaction. Here was the man who had thought he could play savior, the man who now intended to throw him out like trash. Leroy was helpless now, sleeping peacefully, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to break. He placed his hand on the doorknob but suddenly froze. The quiet ticking of a clock from the hallway filled the silence, marking the seconds with an eerie regularity. His mind, which had been so focused, so razor-sharp, now wavered. A thought crept into his head, unbidden and unwelcome, a thought of what would happen after, of what he would be left with once they were gone. In that moment, something in Caleb shifted. It was small, barely perceptible, but enough to shake his certainty. He'd spent so much time building to this, so many nights fantasizing about this moment, but the finality of it suddenly hit him in a way he hadn't expected. Was he really prepared to follow through? To carry out what he'd been planning? As the minutes ticked by, he found himself unable to move, his hand hovering just inches from the door. Every dark thought, every moment of hatred that had fueled him suddenly seemed hollow, its power slipping away, leaving him empty, unsteady. He thought of the family he'd resented, the family he'd despised, and realized, in the strangest way, that they had been the closest thing he'd ever had to one. The night passed slowly. Dawn began to break over the Arizona desert, casting the house in a soft, golden light. Caleb found himself standing in the hallway, rifle still in hand, his shoulders sagging under the weight of a decision he couldn't fully comprehend. The house around him was silent, its occupants still lost in sleep, unaware of the tempest that had nearly torn through their lives. Finally, he put the rifle down, his hands numb, and retreated to his room. The plan had shattered, leaving him empty, lost in a silence he had never felt before. He knew he would never forget this night, the night when his anger had nearly consumed everything. But in the end, he had turned away. And as the sun rose, the weight of his anger, his bitterness, seemed to fall away, leaving him alone with a strange, lingering sense of peace. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt something close to relief. In the early morning haze, Caleb sat alone at the kitchen table, tracing circles on the smooth wood, his fingers leaving faint smudges that would vanish seconds later. The rifle, which he had so nearly used in the dead of night, lay stashed beneath his bed, hidden but far from forgotten. Though dawn had stayed his hand, his anger hadn't faded. Instead, it simmered quietly, finding new resolve in the brightening light of day. He was no longer content with plans and fantasies. He wanted closure, and he wanted it soon. Later that day, the Johnsons decided to have a family outing to the distant hills for a picnic, and attempt to ease the mounting tension that Caleb's presence had introduced to their lives. They thought that fresh air and a bit of nature might soften his edges, might somehow reach the part of him that remained closed off. They invited him with hopeful, expectant smiles, thinking he might finally enjoy a day in the sun with them. Caleb agreed, hiding his intentions behind a tight, forced smile. This would be his opportunity away from the house. The secluded desert would make things clean, silent. He would no longer need to face their pitying looks, their hollow assurances. All of them together in one isolated place would be the perfect end to a story he was determined to close on his own terms. They packed the car with laughter and optimism, oblivious to Caleb's quiet detachment. Diane packed sandwiches and fruit, her careful hands arranging everything in neat stacks, while Leroy loaded chairs and blankets. Caleb sat in the back seat, his gaze fixed on the endless stretch of desert road before them, his hands cold and steady. His mind was focused, his heart as calm as the Arizona sky. When they arrived at the picnic spot, a small plateau overlooking miles of sand and rock, the family scattered, each member absorbed in setting up. The grandparents found shade under a low rock formation, Diane spread out a picnic blanket, and the younger kids ran off to explore a nearby patch of wildflowers. The oldest Johnson child, Daniel, a quiet teenager with a protective streak, stayed nearby, his eyes darting toward Caleb now and then, as if sensing something was off. Caleb watched them all, studying their movements, the ease with which they interacted, each person falling into the rhythm of family. The more he watched, the more he felt the cold, unforgiving clarity settle over him. He realized he wasn't nervous, he wasn't even angry anymore. What he felt was something colder, a strange satisfaction that they would never see coming. As the sun rose higher, casting sharp shadows across the rocks, Caleb slipped back to the car, where he'd hidden the rifle under a blanket. He checked the area, making sure the others were distracted. The sound of laughter floated over from the edge of the plateau where the children were playing, oblivious to the storm brewing just out of sight. In swift, fluid movements, he loaded the rifle. His mind felt clear, focused, like he was seeing everything for the first time. He walked back toward the family with calm, steady steps, the rifle hidden against his side, blending into the shadows cast by the rocky terrain. The first shot echoed across the plateau, a sharp, jarring sound that shattered the peaceful afternoon. Diane, who was kneeling by the picnic blanket, looked up in confusion, her face twisted in horror as she registered the rifle pointed at her. Caleb fired again, the shot ringing out and silencing her scream before it could fully form. She fell back, her body motionless, eyes wide and unseeing. The others froze, the initial shock rooting them to the ground. Leroy reacted first, lunging toward Caleb with a look of betrayal and desperation. Caleb fired, his aim cold and unerring. Leroy staggered, his hand reaching out in a futile attempt to shield himself, but he fell to the ground, his outstretched hand brushing against Diane's. The children, finally grasping the horror before them, scattered in all directions. Caleb's steps were measured, his pace unhurried. He moved toward each one with a methodical detachment, his face expressionless as he found them one by one. Daniel tried to lead his younger siblings toward the car, but Caleb cut them off, blocking their path with the rifle raised, his face calm, eerily serene. "Caleb, please," Daniel choked out, his voice breaking, his hands raised in a plea. The younger siblings huddled behind him, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. But Caleb's gaze was distant, as though he no longer saw them as people, as family, just obstacles in his way. One by one, the shots rang out, each blast swallowed by the vast desert until only silence remained. When it was over, Caleb stood alone, his chest rising and falling in the heavy stillness. He took in the scene around him, the scattered picnic, the sun high in the sky, the bodies lying motionless against the earth. The desert stretched on, empty and indifferent, bearing witness to the tragedy in silence. Caleb, his task complete, sat down on a nearby rock, rifle propped against his leg, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something, a sense of peace, perhaps, or the freedom he'd told himself he would feel. But as the minutes passed, a hollow ache began to creep in. The silence pressed on him, oppressive and suffocating. The emptiness he'd felt all his life hadn't vanished with the act, it had only deepened, spreading through him like poison. There was no relief, no satisfaction, only a deeper, more profound isolation than he'd ever known. The sun continued its slow descent across the sky, casting long shadows over the desert. Caleb sat in the quiet, his mind growing numb, the enormity of what he'd done beginning to weigh on him. He had wanted escape, had sought freedom from the people he'd come to hate, but now, surrounded by nothing but desert and silence, he felt more trapped than ever. The weight of his actions settled heavily on his shoulders as the afternoon bled into evening. And as the first stars appeared in the sky, Caleb remained in that desolate place, alone, bound forever to the memory of what he had done, his hatred consuming him even as it left him empty and utterly alone. The Johnson's family ranch, usually alive with laughter and light, lay in silence the next morning, an eerie stillness filling the air. The vast Arizona desert that had witnessed Caleb's act was quiet, concealing the horror that had taken place. It wasn't until the following day, when a neighbor noticed that no one from the Johnson family had come to town, that concern spread. Deputy Alvarado, a seasoned officer in the small Arizona community, was the first to arrive at the Johnsons' ranch. As he neared the home, something felt off. The absence of movement, no children playing, no morning sounds from the kitchen was unsettling. Alvarado knocked, waited, and then, finding the door unlocked, stepped inside. It was unnervingly tidy, as though the family had simply vanished. The plates were stacked on the counter, and a half-finished glass of milk sat on the table, now soured by the desert heat. It wasn't until Alvarado noticed the missing car that dread crept over him. The Johnsons rarely left without letting neighbors know, especially when all of them were going somewhere. He radioed for backup, reporting the unusual quiet. Within an hour, more officers arrived, and a search of the surrounding desert began. A few miles out, they spotted something glinting on the plateau in the midday sun. As they drew closer, they found the car and the remnants of the picnic, the bright, checkered blanket a stark contrast to the grim scene it concealed. The officers froze, struggling to comprehend what lay before them. The Johnson family lay scattered, still in positions of flight, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and betrayal. The picnic food, now covered in desert dust, sat untouched, a grotesque reminder of their final moments. Deputy Alvarado swallowed hard, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the scene. There was no sign of Caleb among the victims, and an eerie realization crept over him: the one person unaccounted for was the family's newest and most troubled member. The town was in uproar as news of the tragedy spread. The Johnsons were beloved by the community, their lives woven into the fabric of the town. Families that had shared holiday dinners with them, kids who had played alongside the Johnson children, and neighbors who'd watched Leroy work his fields, all were left grappling with the incomprehensible loss. No one could understand what could have pushed Caleb to this, or if he had acted alone. The investigation focused immediately on Caleb, who was still missing. But the search yielded nothing: no footprints leading away from the scene, no signs of struggle beyond the massacre itself. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Detectives pored over the house, Caleb's room, his computer, his phone records, trying to piece together clues about what could have driven him to such violence. Among the findings were disturbing details: hours spent on hate-fueled forums, a growing history of searches about isolation and violence, and private messages with someone who went by Viper, a shadowy online figure who had fueled Caleb's anger and given him a twisted sense of purpose. The exchanges were chilling, filled with phrases that pointed toward resentment, power, and revenge, as well as detailed encouragement that validated Caleb's darkest thoughts. This online connection revealed to the detectives that Caleb had been groomed, his hatred stoked and shaped by someone who had seen the anger festering inside him and fed it until it took on a life of its own. The weeks dragged on without a trace of Caleb, the authorities and townsfolk alike growing increasingly anxious. Flyers with his face were distributed in nearby cities, along interstate routes, and even broadcast on the evening news, but it was as though he had disappeared into the desert sands, swallowed whole by the same emptiness he had tried to escape. Finally, a break came when hikers reported an abandoned campsite in a remote canyon, miles from the Johnson ranch. Investigators found signs of someone who had lived there for days: scattered cans, a discarded blanket, and buried in a shallow pit, the Johnson family's telescope, its lens shattered. A worn journal lay nearby, its pages filled with dark, chaotic scrawls. Fragments of Caleb's thoughts were scribbled within, snippets that betrayed a boy caught in a spiraling hatred he couldn't control, phrases like "they'll never understand" and "freedom only comes in the quiet." But there was no sign of Caleb. The final page held only a single line, written in shaky handwriting: "They took me in, and I took them out." The townspeople were left grappling with the horror, and the mystery of Caleb's fate lingered. Had he wandered further into the desert, escaping the consequences of his actions in the only way he knew how? Or was he hiding, biding his time to re-emerge and continue the path he'd started down? The unanswered questions hung in the air, an unsettling legacy of the boy the Johnsons had tried to save. In the end, the desert held its secrets close, leaving the town haunted by the tragedy and by the boy who had vanished, leaving only a trail of grief and questions that would never be answered. As weeks turned into months, the Johnson family's massacre remained at the center of the town's grief and disbelief. Authorities worked tirelessly to reconstruct the events of that day, piecing together Caleb's troubled psyche, his motivations, and most crucially, the role of the mysterious Viper. With each new revelation, the case grew darker, exposing a calculated manipulation that suggested Caleb's descent had not been accidental but orchestrated. Detectives focused their investigation on Caleb's digital footprint. Hours were spent examining his online interactions, which led to the twisted world he had immersed himself in, one that validated his darkest thoughts. Through encrypted messages, Caleb had communicated extensively with Viper, an anonymous figure who had left virtually no traceable identity. Viper's messages weren't merely encouraging Caleb's anger, they were feeding it, guiding it, honing it with a strange precision. The messages were filled with language that subtly encouraged Caleb to seek control. To reclaim power over his life, they dissected Caleb's feelings of resentment and twisted them into justifications for violent action. Phrases like "take back what's yours" and "they'll never accept you take your stand first" echoed throughout the conversations. Viper had shaped Caleb's rage and rejection into a weapon, carefully pointing it toward the family that had taken him in. Finally, a breakthrough came. Specialists combing through deep layers of internet logs identified Viper's IP address traced back to a small town just a few hundred miles away. What they uncovered shocked everyone involved. Viper was not a lone extremist, nor a radical teenager in hiding. Viper was a local community figure and former school counselor named Tom Reardon. Tom had worked for years in youth support programs, known for his empathy and dedication to helping troubled youth, often providing them with extra guidance. But something had gone terribly wrong. Tom Reardon's files, when reviewed by detectives, revealed a disturbing pattern. In the past few years, he'd been reported multiple times for unorthodox counseling methods, complaints from students who described him as intense and manipulative. He had quietly left the school system and set up a small online mentorship forum for at-risk youth. Under the guise of guidance, he'd selectively targeted isolated, troubled teens, feeding their resentment under different pseudonyms, Viper among them. Caleb had been just one of several. But none of the others had escalated like this. Detectives apprehended Tom at his modest house on the outskirts of his town, where he was living an unassuming life. Inside, they found a home office filled with files on troubled teens, extensive notes on their mental states, and digital traces of his conversations with Caleb and others. When questioned, Tom denied intending any harm, claiming he was helping kids explore their emotions and giving them the freedom to express what society refused to acknowledge. His words were chilling in their indifference, his demeanor calm as he described his interactions with Caleb as if they were simply therapeutic. But in a twist that shocked investigators, Tom eventually admitted that Caleb's responses had been exceptional to him, remarkably receptive to his ideas, deeply influenced by his words. He spoke about Caleb's anger almost admiringly, saying that Caleb understood the need for change and had the courage to break free. To Tom, Caleb's actions were a reflection of the strength he'd instilled. The interrogation room fell silent as detectives absorbed the coldness of his words. Tom was charged with incitement and manipulation of a minor, facing multiple counts for his role in Caleb's psychological descent. But the case didn't end there. The small town, reeling from the tragedy, demanded answers that went beyond criminal charges. How had such a trusted figure gone unnoticed? How had a respected counselor turned into a puppet master, encouraging vulnerable teens toward destructive paths under the guise of guidance? As the story broke, local news outlets revealed Tom's secret life to the public. Former students and parents who had once trusted him were devastated. His betrayal sent shockwaves through the community, leading to calls for stricter oversight of online forums and youth counselors. It was a revelation that left scars on everyone involved, casting a long shadow over the institutions meant to protect the town's youth. Meanwhile, Caleb's ultimate fate remained unknown. With Tom Reardon's arrest, the investigation closed, but the mystery surrounding Caleb lingered. Speculation spread that Caleb might be hiding somewhere in the desert, living in isolation, cut off from the society he had rejected. Sightings and rumors circulated in the following years: an abandoned campsite found here, footprints discovered near a dry river there, but nothing substantial ever surfaced. Caleb had vanished as completely as if he'd become one with the desert. The Johnson family's home eventually became a somber monument, a reminder of the tragedy and of the delicate nature of the human mind. The community held a vigil every year on the anniversary of their deaths, honoring their memory and reflecting on the dark undercurrents that had led to their untimely end. Caleb's story faded into local lore, a haunting mystery that no one could fully explain, a tale whispered about at night, but never truly understood. And as the years passed, the desert kept its secrets, the quiet expanse a graveyard for the unanswered questions left in the wake of Caleb's disappearance.